Hello and welcome to my channel In Search of Wonder. And today we are going to discuss everything I read in the month of February. So there is a part of me that feels like this is a little superfluous. So tell me in the comments what you think, because I do weekly wrap-ups of what I've read each week where I get pretty in-depth with my thoughts about books. This is more an overview of the month. In general, I do try to talk about things or just look at the books in ways that I didn't look at them in my weekly wrap-ups. Plus, you know, sometimes having a little bit of distance from when you actually read something can give you fresh perspective on it. So I may have a slightly different perspective or remember something different from when I read it before. So anyway, part of me feels like this is superfluous. Part of me feels like it's good and I enjoy doing it. But really, I don't know. So tell me in the comments if you think a monthly recap of my reading is helpful, if you enjoy it, or if you think that the weekly wrap-ups are just sufficient and I can do other content at the beginning of the month instead of reviewing the previous month. But today, this is what we're going to do. Although, honestly, this is the third time I am filming this. Yeah, so that's the other part of me that's like, is it really necessary? But, you know, we're going to go for it. And we are going to talk about all of the things that I read in February. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so to begin with, general overview of my goals. And this is something that I don't necessarily mention in my weekly wrap-ups. So this is fresh content. As far as my goals for the year and in general, my reading goals, I like to take stock of how I did as far as meeting those goals. I have lists in my journal that I am going to be referencing to help me determine how well I did with that. So first of all, I have a list of classic or modern classic authors that I had not read prior to this year and that I wanted to try. And so this month in February, I was able to cross another one off the list, J.R.R. Tolkien. So for this whole list, I have 2 out of 5 knocked out already. And then another list is books that were published in 2023 that I wanted to get to that I hadn't yet. And I was able to cross one off the list, which was The Letter Tree by Rachel Fordham, which I read as a buddy read with Tales on Trees with Tay. I also have a list of from my shelves, books that have been languishing on my shelves that need to be read. And I crossed one off, Master and Commander. I crossed it off rather than checking it off because I didn't read it. I DNF'd it. And then for 2024 releases, I'm doing better on those than I did on 2023 releases. So I added The Lily of Ludgate Hill. And The Divine Proverb of Streusel also. Yes, that was in February as well. Yes. So I checked off 2 from my list. Why is it not focusing there? So I was able to check off 2 off that list. And then I added to my nonfiction reads in 2024. So I am still working on And the Dead Shall Rise, which is a very long nonfiction. So that's taking me a while. But I also read Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland in February, which was a Christian nonfiction read. I also added to my list of DNFs, as I mentioned, Master and Commander. The reason I DNF'd it was the content was just too much for me as far as the protagonist being a womanizer and basically attracted to every single woman who walked by him and having liaisons with married women and blah, blah, blah. I was not into that. And then I found out that it didn't get any better as the book went on. And in fact, the content got significantly worse in that respect. So I was like, I don't need that. Too many good books out there to read than to have to read that. Plus, too much nautical jargon for me. Not really into that. I did add to my 5-star reads though, so that was a good balance. And you probably can't see this yellow writing very well. Sorry, my fingernails, I really need to like redo them, but sorry, haven't done that yet. Anyways, Gentle and Lowly was a 5-star read for me. So adding to my 5-star reads, which is always fun. One should do that if one can. And as far as my goals, my reading goals for the year and generally speaking go, I managed to accomplish a few things in February, so well done me. For the month overall, I read 12 books, which is the same as January, and which is actually quite good for me. So you can see the pink books are my February books, and I read 12. 12 in January, 12 in February. I was happy with that. For the challenges that I participate in, the Read Your Bookshelf Challenge with Chantel, I am on the Doyle track. And so for February, the book was to read a book under 250 pages. So Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland fills that. For the Tea and Ink Society, Read the Classics Challenge for February, we were supposed to read a Nordic or Scandinavian classic, and I read the summer book for that. And then for the What the Dickens book club, we were supposed to read poetry by Robert Burns or any romantic poetry. I focused on Robert Burns. I checked a book out of the library and read some by him. I didn't talk about it much, I don't think, on any of my wrap-ups. So I really enjoyed his poetry. I loved the flow, even if I didn't understand the ones that where he was really writing a lot of in the Scottish dialect. Even if I didn't fully understand everything that he was saying, I loved the flow of the language. And once you got into the rhythm, you were able to really understand a lot of it. I also found that on Spotify and YouTube, you can listen to people singing, because a lot of his poems are songs. So that was fun. I enjoyed that. So I really got to, I got to read a lot more Robert Burns than I had ever had before, which I really enjoyed, because when I did the FebRegency tag, I realized that I had not spent much time individually with specific poets of the Romantic era. I'd read a smattering of their poetry across, you know, the 5 or 6 different famous guys who wrote poetry during that time. But I had not like really gotten a sense of any individual poets. So it was good to read Robert Burns poetry, and I enjoyed that very much. So now, here is my spread for the month of February of the 12 books that I read. And for the majority of this video, I'm just going to kind of compare and contrast and walk through the books that I read, any new thoughts that I have had about them since I last talked about them, and just my thoughts in general on my reading in February and how it went. So I read 3 Regency romance novels in February, which is a lot for me. I mean, it is a genre that I enjoy, but I don't normally read like 3 in a row. But I did because it was FebRegency, and because Valentine's Day, and because my anniversary was in February. So I was feeling in a romantic mood, and I just love the Regency era in England. And so it just was a fun choice for me. However, the 3 that I read, the first one was a bit of a disappointment, which I talked about at length, so I won't say too much about that. That was Miss Newberry's List. 2.5 stars. Did not love that. And you can watch my video to hear all the reasons why if you haven't heard that already. And then the next one was Lucy and the Duke of Secrets by Sophie Laporte, which was fine, but forgettable. As I put in my little bullet points review, fun story, fun characters, forgettable, improbable, and unlikely. Clean, sweet romance. You know, I didn't hate it. It was fun while it lasted, but it's not something that I will think about, barely remember now. But what I did enjoy very much was A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting, and I talked about that in my most recent weekly reading wrap-up. A cheeky twist on the marriage fortune hunter plot, marriage marked fortune hunter, and definitely a romance, but not at the same time. I'll get back to that in a second. George Hare-esque with hints of Austen too. So the writing style was very much a nod to Georgette Hare, and some of the plot elements were also a nod to Georgette Hare. She definitely has like the madcap heroine with these ideas that she pursues, but not fully with engaging all of her common sense. And then there's also always, in Georgette Hare novels, there's very often a younger sibling, usually a younger brother, who gets themselves into scrapes that end up being often very serious, and so the older brother has to help rescue them. And so there was definitely that aspect of things. Also had a lot of similar humor and wit that you would find in a Georgette Hare novel. There were also definitely some nods to Austen's plots in some of her books. We have a family of 5 girls, and their futures are not settled. Their parents did not leave them any kind of money. They have property, but the property is mortgaged and they are in danger of losing it. And without the property, they have 0 income. So the oldest daughter takes it upon herself to rescue her family by marrying someone. So that's where the plot comes in. She is determined to find a husband for herself who can take on her family's debts and support her sisters as they all get old enough to marry and leave the nest. I don't want to say too much more about it because I think I talked about it at length, but one thing I did want to mention that I don't think I said before in my review of it was that I did find it interesting that the actual romance in the story that takes place is not the one that the heroine is intending to take place. And it kind of takes place off screen, so to speak. Not really, because you know, the scenes are described where the characters spend time together and get to know each other, etc. But it's not where the spotlight is, especially in the protagonist's mind's eye. In her opinion, and as the story is largely told from her point of view, I believe she's like pursuing this over here. Meanwhile, she's oblivious to this happening over here. And the realization kind of dawns on her towards the end of the story very slowly. And then all of a sudden she realizes, oh. And so that is kind of interesting. That was a fun aspect of the story that I enjoyed. And then I read 2 other secular, well, clean romances, Lily of Ludgate Hill by Mimi Matthews, and then The Letter Tree by Rachel Fordham, both of which were buddy reads, so that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. Miriam and I read The Lily of Ludgate Hill, and we both loved it very much. So this was definitely probably one of 2 or 3 absolute favorite fiction reads of February. Enjoyed it so much. It's the 3rd in a series. It's kind of enemies to lovers or second chance, a little bit of both. Themes of grief and hurt and forgiveness, which interestingly, there were a lot of, as you'll see as I'm talking about more of these books, that forgiveness and reconciliation were big themes in a lot of the books that I read. So I just find that interesting when like books are talking to each other in that way, kind of unintentionally. You just end up reading them in a certain sequence, but they have similar threads that keep catching your eye. So there were definitely those themes in this story. Great chemistry and banter between the 2 main characters, and I love the role that fashion played in the story. That was just really a clever aspect of the story that I enjoyed very much. It wasn't just, she wore this dress. It was the dress was part of what was telling the story about the character and about the character's development and where they are and where they're going, etc. So it wasn't just the fashion choices were not merely for a pleasing mental image of the characters. It was part of telling their story. So that was really cool. But the thing that I wanted to mention about this, I don't know that I mentioned it before, is that I really felt like, so our main character's name is Anne, and I really felt like the hero of the story, Felix Hartford, was very much a Gilbert Blythe sort of character from Anne of Green Gables. And their relationship definitely had some of that dynamic. They're very different people. They're very different drawn characters, but there was some of that dynamic in their relationship. And where Gilbert Blythe just faithfully loved Anne until she finally got rid of her stubbornness and let go of her stubbornness and allowed herself to admit that all along she had been interested in him and had loved him as well. And so there's a very similar dynamic happening in this story. And our hero is just so faithfully loving the heroine in the story, sacrificing for her even when she doesn't realize it and notice or appreciate what he's doing for her. And just being consistently loving and kind to her all of the time. And also, he's not like a stuffy, boring, self-absorbed character. He's humorous and charming, and he makes her laugh all at the same time. And so I really enjoyed that dynamic in that story. That was a great one. And then The Letter Tree I read with Taylor, and we both did not love it as much, even though a lot of people loved that story. We were prepared to love it, but then we were a little bit disappointed. The actual story between the two characters was fun. It was a mashup of You've Got Mail and Romeo and Juliet, which was, and the way the author mixed those up was fantastic. That was great. I think just that alone would have been a great romance novel. But then she added this layer of mystery, and I feel like that's what really did the novel in for me, because it was just so thin. The whole process of them uncovering why their parents had a feud in the first place and what had happened that tore them apart when they used to be great friends. That mystery and the reasons involved in that just seemed thin to me, and the discovery of everything was just, like convenient coincidences and almost, I don't know, it just, and it just got wrapped up very quickly. And then there was another side plot that I could have done without that was supposed to add like tension to the storyline, where the girl's father was trying to get her to develop a relationship with this single businessman that he wanted to have dealings with. And then there was a whole side thread involving him and criminal activity and all of this stuff. And again, everything got wrapped up very quickly. And it was just thin. I just felt like that part was just not as well done, and kind of really detracted from the story. And yeah, so in the end, I gave that one 3 stars, but Lily of Ludgate Hill, I gave 4.5 stars because I really enjoyed it very much. And then I read 2 very, very different Christian fiction books in the month of February. So the first one was The Divine Proverb of Struzal, which was one of the new releases that I had actually pre-ordered this year. I was so excited to read it. And then the other was Fairest of Heart by Karen Whitemeyer, which released, I think, last year maybe, or the year before. And so I'm like the last person in the world to read it. But I was able to sneak that one in for Faebruary, the Faebruary readathon with Tales and Trees with Tay and Celestria and Christy A. Cole, and I forget who all else did that one. But I was able to sneak in a read with that, so that was fun. I enjoyed that. But back to The Divine Proverb of Struzal real quick. So I gave that 4.5 stars, and I really loved it. It wasn't as much of a favorite as the author's debut novel was, The Extraordinary Deaths of Mrs. Kipp, which was my all-time favorite last year. But it was still very, very, very well done. I think the only reason I knocked it down half a star was because it moved very slowly. So I think I would just prefer to have a faster moving story with maybe more going on. But I enjoyed how she dug into the thoughts and feelings of the characters that she was writing about, and she really took her time crafting a beautiful story, and there was so much to love and appreciate about it. So that's really a minor thing. Generally speaking, I just really enjoyed this story thoroughly. I won't say anymore about that really because I spoke about it at length in one of my weekly wrap-ups. But I will say that this was another one that had very strong themes of forgiveness and reconciliation. Our main character is dealing with a lot of hurt from the way that her father has left the family and divorced her mother and married someone else, and just the way that he's treated the family in the process of all of that. And so she really has to go through this process of forgiving him and being reconciled toward him and reestablishing some kind of relationship with him. And so that is a huge theme of the book. But part of it is also something else I really loved was a very big theme about accepting your heritage and the people who came before you in all of their mix of good and bad as being your heritage and accepting that. And I think that is something that some of us can, like the modern generation, I feel like we can struggle with that sometimes. So I felt like that was a very timely theme there. That was very important. So I thoroughly enjoyed that book, but I won't say any more about it right now. Fairest of Hearts by Karen Whitmire. I talked about in my most recent wrap-up, I believe, and it's a fairy tale retelling of the Snow White, based largely on the Disney movie version, I think, rather than the, Grimm's fairy tale version, or is Snow White a French Charles Perrault one? I'm not sure. Anyway, but it was definitely based on the Disney version, and humorous and charming. Our heroine was a little perfect, a little too sweet, but I mean, that's how she was in the Disney movie. So that's what we're working with here. That's the format there. So what do you expect? I was honestly a little bit skeptical of this one going in, which may be why I enjoyed it so much, because I didn't have like super high expectations. I always enjoy Karen Whitmire, her humor, and her engaging storytelling style. I usually love her characters. But this one, I knew that I liked her writing typically, but I don't read a lot of fairy tale retellings, and also I wasn't really sure how Snow White would work in a Western setting, but it was actually very charmingly well done, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. That was a sick day read for me, and I had a good time with that. Then moving on to the classics that I read in February, which I read 4. So The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith, which was for FebRegency, and also Hornblower and His Majesty, which was a short story also for FebRegency. And then The Summer Book by Tove Jansson, and Baron and Luthien by J.R. Tolkien. So let's see. Let's start with the short story, Hornblower and His Majesty. It was fine. It was a short story, part of a series. I would be willing to read more Horatio Hornblower stories. It definitely did not have, it wasn't as intense with a nautical jargon as Master and Commander was. And it was just less serious, for lack of a better word. It was just more of a fun read in the style and the mood of the story writing. So I definitely would be willing to read another book in that series. I gave that one 3 stars. And then I read The Summer Book as my Nordic or Scandinavian classic for the Reading the Classics challenge. And it was written in 1972, originally in Swedish, by a Finnish author, Tove Jansson. And it's not a linear story. It's just a series of vignettes set in summer in the Gulf of Finland. Again, I talked about it at length, the things that I loved about it and the things that I didn't love about it. By and large, I loved it, and I gave it 4 stars altogether. Definitely an interesting choice for February, but I thoroughly enjoyed my time reading that book. And then I read Baron and Luthien by J.R. Tolkien for Protagonist Pub's book club. And I loved the fairy tale aspect of the story, the lush and eloquently descriptive writing. It was a beautiful tale of love and courage. I was really immersed in the lovely imagery that Tolkien used in writing the story. Just absolutely beautiful writing. The only thing I didn't like was that it was just that beautiful writing just was rudely interrupted by editorial notes by Christopher Tolkien explaining the evolution of the story throughout the different phases of Tolkien writing it, and the differences between the prose version and the poetic version, and that just was jarring. Honestly, if all of it had been confined to like preface or an afterword or something like that, or an appendix at the end, I probably would not have read most of it. It was very dry and boring, and the story stood on its own perfectly fine. It didn't need all of that explanation, I don't think. So the story itself, 5 stars. That book, the packaging of it and everything, the way that it was presented, 4.5 stars, but it was very good. The other classic I read was The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith, which was such an interesting read. So this is the oldest book that I read in February. It was published in the 1700s, 1762, according to my notes. And I mentioned in my review of it, in my weekly wrap-up, that it was almost kind of like 2 different books. Like there's a point where the narrative shifts. Like first you have this kind of narrator who there's like satire, or like you don't trust him as a narrator because what he says and what he does are different things. But then it shifts to a much more serious, straightforward narrative, interspersed with all of these little dialogues and monologues about political things and religious things, and then there's like these poems and speeches and all of this stuff that's interspersed in the narrative. So it's like 2 different types of stories. And also I was very confused because, well, not confused is not the right word, but I was intrigued because so many people respond to it very differently. And like you can have people reading the book and reading it all the way through as a serious, straight narrative and taking it seriously as a novel being told sincerely. And then you have people who take it as satire, which is how I took at least the first half of it for sure. And catch the irony in there and the satire in there. There's this debate about whether it's a serious novel or satire. And I was talking about it to Dia because she and several others read it as a buddy read and definitely read it seriously. And I was telling her someone should write a thesis about this because it's just so intriguing to me that different people who are well read can read this book and walk away having read it very differently. On a whim, I kind of looked up, and sure enough, someone had written a thesis about it. So if I'm able to find it, I will link to it in the description box because it was very interesting. And in this thesis, he was, the person who wrote it was positing that it was neither meant to be read as a novel or as satire, but as a third category altogether, which is an epilogue. And I was not really familiar with epilogues with the term or exactly what an epilogue was, but thankfully he explained it thoroughly in his thesis. And then he went on to demonstrate and discuss how The Vicar of Wakefield fits much better with the structure of an epilogue than it does with a novel or even a satire. And one thing that was very convincing to me was that this is a framework that Oliver Goldsmith was familiar with, that he had used before. And in the thesis, we get a full synopsis and analysis of an epilogue that Oliver Goldsmith had written previously to this novel or book, and that it wasn't the only instance of his writing epilogues that were clearly like no argumentation. You know, these were definitely intended to be epilogues. He was definitely working within the framework of that style. And so the author of this thesis was saying that he felt strongly that The Vicar of Wakefield fit much more into that structure than it did into a novel or satire. And as he went through the various defining characteristics and factors of an epilogue, and he analyzed The Vicar of Wakefield according to that, it made a lot of sense. And I feel like he may be onto something. I'm not an expert by any means, but it was making the book make sense for me, and it also makes sense why people have trouble fitting it into the novel box or the satire box, because it wasn't intended to fit fully into either one of those. It's something different over here. So he also said that it would definitely is a twofold epilogue. So there's two main sections to the story, and that's why you have that narrative shift in the middle. So, and there's a different theme for each section of the book. And I would disagree a little bit with the statements that he made for the themes of both halves of the book, but I think that he was generally on the right track, and that the first half of the book was about prudence, and the second half of the book was about fortitude or faith and hope in eternity. And maybe that faith and hope in eternity is what gives you fortitude to deal with the trials of life that you experience. And the reason why I agree with that assessment is because a couple of things, and that made the book make more sense, and it also made it a better book when you're able to see it through the right perspective. Because in the story, the characters do not behave consistently. And the things that happen in the story, it's not realistic in the way that it happens. And what happens to some of the characters, like sometimes it honestly borders on farcical. So, but in a novel, that would be bad. That would be a badly written novel. But in an epilogue, everything that happens in the story, everything the characters say and do is illustrating the theme or the main idea. So it doesn't have to be realistic or consistent with the character's personality or whatever. It just has to be consistent with the theme. So that makes a lot of things make a lot more sense that happen in the story, especially as we get closer to the end. And so in the first half of the story, we have where the satire comes in, is that it's all about prudence, and how the vicar and his family have zero prudence. Like, he makes foolish decisions that end up losing all of their money. Like, they were comfortably situated at the beginning of the story, but he naively and foolishly trusts someone with all of his money and his investments, and so they lose everything. So then they have to majorly downsize and move to the country, but they continue to make foolish mistakes, and they are trying to sell this or that thing, and they end up being fleeced by people. And then they make this ridiculously large painting portrait of their family, even when they live in a house that's not large enough to contain the work of art when it's done. So they just do all of these foolish things. They don't have wisdom, they don't have prudence, and they don't demonstrate it. And even though all of the time the vicar is saying things that sound wise and good, etc., his actions and the actions of his family show that they don't actually have prudence or wisdom. And because of that, they keep failing at life. And so it's like Job, like everything bad that can happen happens to them. And so they end up in this terrible predicament. So from that point on in the story, they are trying to recover from all of the failures that they had gotten themselves into. And this is the part where, well, let me back up a second. So the secondary theme is that faith and hope in eternity gives you fortitude to survive the difficulties of life. And so the vicar and his family, they're going through all of these difficult things, and it makes them stronger, makes them wiser, makes them more loving with each other. And even though like things keep getting worse, and the last chapter, it takes place in the prison, and all of this stuff, they learn as they go along, and they gain an eternal perspective. And then there's like a culminating speech or sermon that the vicar preaches to his inmates in the prison and anybody who will listen to him about eternity, and how even if everything goes wrong in life, our hope is in eternity. And I think for me, and then everything gets like wrapped up with that, with the story, and all of the different threads are unraveled and then tied together, and everything ends up tied in a neat bow, somewhat miraculously. But because he now has an eternal perspective, and he's not trying to make his life work on his own, he's shifted to an eternal perspective. So I think the overarching theme that connects the two different sections of the book is that while it is good to have wisdom and prudence in this life, wisdom and prudence alone are not enough. We are going to need to have faith and a hope for eternity, because no matter how wise or prudent you are, things will happen. Bad things will happen to you. And you will have to go through difficulties in life, and you have to be able to face them somehow. And so you're going to need to have something more than just trusting in your own wisdom and your own strength, or your own understanding. So that seemed to be the overall arching theme that connects those two ideas in those two separate sections of the book. So reading that thesis was really super helpful to me and helped me to understand and appreciate the book on a much deeper level than I had before. So I really appreciated that, and I just wanted to share those thoughts in this recap, because I hadn't read that by the time I made the weekly wrap up when I last spoke about that book. So it was just very interesting to me. Hopefully that was interesting to you. And also, I think it's a really intriguing book to read, especially if you have a good context for understanding it. Finally, the last one I want to mention is Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland, which I talked about a lot in my last weekly wrap up. Definitely one of the best Christian nonfiction books. I've read some really good ones recently, but this one is definitely up there with one of my favorites, and it's one I will revisit at some point for sure. It's worth rereading. I took my time. I read a chapter every night and just really savored the truth and the beauty that were in that book, and I just thoroughly enjoyed it. So I highly recommend Gentle and Lowly, and I gave it 5 stars. So that was my 1 5-star read. But in terms of enjoyment of the story and looking back and saying, oh, that was a really good book, or a book that will stick with me, I actually read like February was a good month for that. There was Gentle and Lowly was wonderful. Baron and Luthien was amazing. The Lily of Ludgate Hill was very good. These are all very different and disparate books, but each in their own way was a wonderful experience to read. And then maybe on the next level would be The Divine Proverb of Struzel and The Vicar of Wakefield and The Summer Book and Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting and The Fairest of Heart. Those all kind of like rank there with the, in the range of I really enjoyed that book, had a great time reading it. And yeah, so February was a good month for me in terms of reading in both quantity and quality. Had some duds and some forgettable reads, but overall, very rich and rewarding reading month. So that is my recap for February. I hope you enjoyed. Please tell me how you feel generally about me doing a monthly recap, in addition to my weekly reading wrap-ups that I do. And if you want me to continue doing that, or if you would like to see a different format or a different way of doing them, I'm open to suggestions. I'm open to just not doing them, because very often in a month I have more ideas of videos that I want to do than I actually have time to do them. So I have other videos that I could do instead. So just let me know what you think. And also let me know what you read in February that you really enjoyed, and what were your favorite reads. Did any of these interest you, intrigue you? Have you read any of them? Will you put any of them on your TBR? And just let me know. Let's have a conversation in the comments. Thank you so much for being here and for spending the time with me and for chatting with me. I enjoy it so much. One of the highlights of my week. And so anyways, have a great day. Sorry this was late. Hopefully I won't have any more technical difficulties. Talk to you later. Bye.